Have you ever wondered what lurks in the shadows of the mind, transforming envy into something that can shake entire kingdoms and change the destiny of a nation? What if I told you that the most captivating and disturbing villains in cinema, like Scar from The Lion King, reveal uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about what we are capable of when resentment takes over? Prepare for a deep and intriguing journey into the psyche, where the line between ambition and desolation becomes thin, and the desperate search for recognition can lead to unimaginable paths, filled with betrayal and despair. In the vast and vibrant ecosystem of the Pride Lands, where the sun bathes the savannas and life pulses in harmony under Mufasa's wise and just command, there lived a lion who, from birth, seemed destined to live under an inescapable shadow. This was Scar, the younger brother of the future king, whose original name, Taka, meant trash or desire in some interpretations, already foreshadowing an existence of longing and worthlessness. Unlike Mufasa, who radiated strength and innate leadership that drew everyone to him, Scar was lean, with a sharp intellect and cunning eyes, but a presence that never quite matched his brother's. He was the contrast, the antithesis, the dark side of the coin. From the first roars, Mufasa's natural majesty, his imposing presence, and the way light seemed to follow and glorify him, eclipsed Scar's presence. Scar's life was a constant reminder of his secondary position, an existence painfully defined by comparison rather than by his own merit. He bore the name of a scar, a physical stigma that symbolized the invisible but profound mark he felt on his soul, the wound of invisibility and unworthiness. The environment in which Scar developed was permeated by a sense of constant frustration and a deep feeling of injustice. He observed Mufasa with a corrosive mixture of envy and contempt, feeling that admiration and power were granted to his brother by a mere accident of birth, the right of primogeniture, and not by intellectual superiority or cunning, qualities that Scar believed he possessed in abundance and which, in his mind, should be the true criteria for leadership. He saw himself as the misunderstood genius, the born strategist, the visionary who was being prevented from shining and leading the kingdom into a new era. This perception of injustice became the foundation of his identity, nurturing a silent bitterness that crystallized and hardened over the years, transforming into petrified resentment. This bitterness was incessantly fed by an inferiority complex that he desperately tried to mask with subtle arrogance, cutting sarcasm, and sharp wit. He convinced himself that the universe was biased, conspiring against him, favoring the good, the strong, and the barbaric over the smart, the perceptive, and the civilized. For Scar, the system of the circle of life was a sham, a tool to perpetuate Mufasa's mediocrity and his lineage, a tradition that needed to be broken for true merit to prevail. In this scenario of self-deception and profound resentment, we begin to observe Scar's first psychological trait, a deep latent narcissism mixed with a sense of relative deprivation. He firmly believed he was entitled to a status and recognition that were denied to him, that he was the true and sole deserving heir to the throne, and that his intelligence and ambition were undeniable proof of this. His mind meticulously began to craft a narrative where he was the victim of a cosmic conspiracy, deserving much more, but thwarted by unjust circumstances. He did not see Mufasa's kindness, justice, or inherent strength. He only saw the dazzling light that blinded others to his own brilliance, a light that, in his distorted view, condemned him to eternal obscurity. He spent years cultivating this view, transforming resentment into a philosophy of life, a personal creed. With every roar of Mufasa that was cheered, with every demonstration of his popularity and wisdom, Scar sank deeper into his own internal reclusion, fueling a dangerous flame of dissatisfaction, of silent hatred, and a growing, uncontrollable desire to subvert the natural order of things, to turn the tables in his favor. But there was something no one saw coming. The silent and relentless construction of a plan in his mind. A plan that would transform this internal frustration into a movement that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom, forever changing the destiny of the Pride lands and the very concept of leadership and power. Scar's breaking point was not a single, dramatic event, a sudden flash of madness, but rather an insidious series of micro-traumas, perceived neglects, and painful comparisons that accumulated and solidified over time, corroding his very essence. Each time Mufasa was praised for his courage, wisdom, leadership, or even for his mere imposing presence, Scar felt a sharp sting, a penetrating and cruel reminder of his own irrelevance within the established hierarchy. The emotional trigger, however, can be clearly seen in Mufasa's continuous exaltation and, even more powerfully, in the birth of Simba. The arrival of the king's cub represented the absolute certainty that Scar would never be king, extinguishing any flicker of hope for legitimate ascension. Every nod of approval for Mufasa, every song in his honor, every expectation placed on the heir, served as a direct blow to Scar's already fragile self-esteem, solidifying his position as the second best, and worse, as dispensable, an unbearable burden for his grandiose ego. This generated chronic resentment, a deep and constant bitterness that poisoned his perception of reality and further isolated him. It is here that Scar begins his dangerous transformation, from a merely resentful lion to a being consumed by a bitter resolve to take what he believed was rightfully his. His charm and seductive speech, once merely superficial social tools to disguise his inner discontent, become sharp weapons of manipulation. He learns to whisper poison into unwary ears, to exploit the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of others, like the marginalized and discontented hyenas, and to use his sharp intellect not to build or innovate, but to destabilize, corrupt, and destroy the status quo. The internal conflict of his desperate search for validation, for being seen and recognized as the supreme leader, directly clashes with the external conflict of his inferior position, which he saw as an unjust and suffocating prison. He feels trapped in a role that does not align with his perception of his own grandeur, and this cognitive dissonance, the difference between what he believes he is and what he actually is in the context of the kingdom, is what drives his increasingly darker actions. Psychology would explain this transformation through the concept of learned helplessness mixed with an exacerbated narcissistic reactivity. Instead of seeking validation in a constructive way, by accepting his place, finding a different purpose, or developing his skills healthily, Scar, feeling powerless to change the external perception of his own dignity through conventional means, chooses the path of manipulation, intrigue, and deconstruction. He projects his frustrations onto the system and the figures of authority. With each perceived defeat, with each blow to his inflated ego, his sense of entitlement intensifies. Cruelty, for him, is not an end in itself, but a means, a consequence of the belief that the world is fundamentally unfair to him, and that the only way to balance the scales and obtain what he deserves is through drastic, ruthless, and morally questionable acts. The continuous denial of his legitimate recognition fuels a vicious cycle of resentment and a growing desire for absolute control. This desire for control is not just about physical power, but about the validation he believes power will bring, the definitive proof that he, Scar, was indeed superior. He convinces himself that once he is at the top, everyone will see his true worth, and applause will come, even if gained by force or through fear. And it was there that everything began to crumble. With each step Scar took toward his ambition, with each seed of discord he planted, the fabric of the kingdom's harmony began to unravel, invisibly, like silk threads coming apart under relentless pressure, foreshadowing the devastating storm to come. Scar's distorted mind, once merely a seed of discontent and envy, began to mold itself into a complex and terrifying structure of calculated malevolence and ruthless coldness. Facts, speeches, and attitudes reveal a new way of thinking, where the lives of others become mere disposable pieces on his chessboard of power, without any intrinsic value or consideration. He observes the hyenas marginalized, hungry, and desperate for acceptance and a place in the circle of life, and he sees them not as living beings with needs and dignity, but as disposable tools, a subservient army to be exploited to achieve his goal. He expertly exploits their misery and hopelessness, promising them a place at the table, privileges, and abundant hunting, promises he never truly intended to keep permanently, only as long as they were useful. His speech, once merely seductive to mask his envy and subtly manipulate, is now tinged with biting cynicism and an overwhelming ability to persuade even the most vulnerable, exploiting their deepest hopes and fears. He builds alliances based on fear, corruption, and the empty promise of a better future, becoming a master in the art of deceptive rhetoric and nefarious persuasion, a true demagogue. Leading the audience into Scar's mind, we understand that he does not see himself as a villain in the traditional sense of pure, gratuitous evil. In his sick perception, he is the superior intellect, the born strategist, the most capable lion to govern, the one who truly deserved the throne, but who was unjustly passed over by an obsolete system blind to his genius. Mufasa's majesty was, in his view, merely a facade, a leadership based on tradition and charisma, and not on merit, sagacity, or intelligence, which Scar believed he possessed in abundance. He convinces himself that he is correcting a cosmic injustice, an act of redemption for himself and, ironically, for the kingdom, which he believes is stagnant under Mufasa's mediocrity and his naive ideals of the circle of life. This rationalization, this ability to justify his most heinous acts, is a pillar of his distorted psyche, allowing him to perform deplorable actions without a shred of guilt or regret, because, in his mind, he is doing what is right for him and for the kingdom. We can use the analogy of the inverted self-fulfilling prophecy to understand his disturbing logic. He firmly believes that the world is unfair to him, that he is a victim of circumstances and traditions, and this belief leads him to act in ways that, paradoxically, confirm his own perception of being despised or underestimated, perpetuating the cycle of isolation, resentment, and an ever-growing desire to prove his worth through total control and the annihilation of his opponents. His manipulation of the hyenas and his elaborate plot to overthrow Mufasa are not impulsive acts driven by momentary rage. They are the result of cold, almost scientific planning on how to subvert the established order and ascend to power at any cost. It is the manifestation of a personality disorder that leads him to believe that his desires and his personal justice are more important than the lives and dignity of others, and that greatness can be imposed, not earned through respect, cooperation, and genuine leadership. Scar's deep and frightening lack of empathy is not a flaw in his character, but a fundamental trait that allows him to devise ruthless plans and execute them without the burden of conscience, making him even more dangerous and unpredictable. But the true monster was still dormant, waiting for the exact moment and the perfect opportunity to reveal itself in all its extent, when the kingdom's vulnerability would be at its peak and his plan could be brought to fruition, forever changing the face of the Pride Lands and plunging them into an era of darkness. Scar's act of total transgression, the point of no return on his journey into darkness, is the meticulous orchestration of Mufasa's fall, an event that would echo for generations and forever alter the course of the Pride Lands' history. It was not an accident, nor an impulsive act of momentary rage, but the culmination of a diabolical plan, conceived in the darkness of his mind through years of resentment, envy, and a burning desire for power. He lures Mufasa into the gorge ambush, using Simba's innocence as bait and the brute force of the hyenas as his loyal army. demonstrating his supreme capacity for manipulation and his calculating cruelty. By so treacherously bringing down the king, Scar not only eliminates a rival and an obstacle to his throne, he annihilates the symbol of everything that oppressed him, of all the light that overshadowed him, of all the tradition that relegated him to the shadows, and of a system he despised. In that crucial instant, his worldview completely shifts. He is no longer the envious and secondary lion, the eternal supporting character. He's the architect of his own destiny, the new leader who fixed the kingdom, who freed it from Mufasa's monotony and weakness in his own distorted perception of reality. He feels a perverse euphoria, an indescribable sense of absolute power that validates all his darkest beliefs, a triumph he had awaited and planned for his entire life. Morality and ethics for Scar are flexible concepts, entirely shaped by his own convenience and unbridled ambition. He rationalizes his actions not as cruelty, murder, or betrayal, but as the inevitable reconfiguration of an unjust and antiquated system that had wronged him and prevented him from ascending. Guilt is a burden he vehemently refuses to bear, skillfully shifting it onto circumstances, onto Mufasa's arrogance for not being strong enough to escape his fate, or, in Simba's case, onto the innocent victim himself, manipulating him into feeling responsible for his father's tragic end and encouraging him to flee into exile. He convinces himself that he acted out of necessity, out of an intrinsic right of a superior being, a right that had been denied to him for years and which he needed to seize by force. This capacity for extreme rationalization and deflection of responsibility is a pillar of his psyche, allowing him to sleep at night without the burden of remorse, genuinely believing that he acted with justice, according to his own distorted worldview. We can draw the audience into a disturbing dilemma. What if, in an alternate universe, Scar's intellectual abilities, his sagacity, and his cunning had been recognized and channeled for the good of the kingdom? He could have been a brilliant advisor, a strategic leader who would bring prosperity to the kingdom in a different way than Mufasa, perhaps even complementing his vision. But the lack of recognition, the persistent shadow of his brother, and Scar's own choice to feed resentment led him to divert these qualities for destructive purposes. The question that echoes is, how close to the thin line between ambition and despair are many of us? And what happens when that line is crossed, when the desire for validation and power transforms into an impulse for the destruction of everything and everyone in our path? What prevents us from following the same path when we feel wronged or invisible? When the darkness of envy begins to consume and rationalization becomes a weapon of psychological self-defense. Mufasa's fall was a tremor in the fabric of the Pride Lands, a cataclysm that destabilized the circle of life, the harmony between species and hope itself. But for Scar, it was liberation, the moment of coronation of his own distorted vision of justice and power. Now, the path was clear, but the nature of his conquest, based on blood and lies, would be the burden that would accompany him. Or would he truly believe in his own narrative of redemption and merit? The void left by his action, the loss of true balance, would soon prove more devastating than he could imagine. For power gained through transgression rarely brings the lasting satisfaction one hoped for, only an even greater emptiness. Delving deeper into Scar's psychological analysis, everything he did, no matter how terrible it may seem to external observers, makes a macabre and perversely coherent sense within his own internal logic and distorted mind. His behavior can be validated and understood through various theories of human behavior, especially narcissistic personality disorder. Individuals diagnosed with NPD frequently exhibit a grandiose and inflated sense of self-importance, a deep and constant need for admiration, an unwavering belief in their own superiority, and, crucially, a striking lack of empathy. Scar fits this profile perfectly. He believes he is the only lion truly capable of governing with intelligence and vision. He relentlessly seeks validation of his superiority, and he does not hesitate to manipulate, betray, or harm others to achieve his goals, viewing them merely as disposable means to an end, without any regard for their lives, feelings, or the consequences of his actions. Studies on MPD and the psychology of cruelty show that malice and transgression do not arise from nothing. They are frequently a defense mechanism against deep-seated feelings of inadequacy, vulnerability, or inferiority that the individual cannot process or accept healthily. For Scar, madness does not exist. What exists is a cold and precise calculation to obtain what he believes is rightfully his, a right that, in his mind, was stolen from him by nature and tradition. The manipulation of Simba, making him feel responsible for Mufasa's fall and subsequent exile, is a shrewd example of his ability to deflect blame, to project his own failures and crimes onto others, and to maintain his own impeccable and justified image in his mind, even in the face of heinous acts. He constructs a parallel reality, an internal narrative where he is the hero of his own saga, the savior who freed the kingdom from archaic and inefficient leadership. We can draw clear and disturbing parallels with historical figures or fictional characters who, driven by a profound inferiority complex or an exacerbated sense of entitlement, sought power at any cost, using manipulation, deceit, and cruelty as their primary tools. Consider leaders who deemed themselves chosen or superior, and who, in their pursuit of dominion and absolute control, caused great suffering and devastation, always justifying their actions as necessary, inevitable, or for a greater good. These stories serve as a somber warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition and a mind that refuses to recognize the validity, dignity, and rights of others. Scar's logic is the logic of self-preservation taken to the extreme, where his existence and his self-proclaimed merit supersede any moral or ethical consideration, and where destruction is viewed as a legitimate means to achieve personal justice, a means to reconstruct the world in his own image. It was not madness. It was cold calculation, the perverse result of a psyche shaped by bitterness, envy, and an unwavering belief in his own supremacy, even when that belief led him to destroy everything around him and ultimately to his own ruin. Scar's mind is a disturbing testament to how the absence of empathy, chronic resentment, and the projection of insecurities can lead to complete devastation, not just for the individual, but for their entire environment. What remains after the turmoil and tyrannical reign of Scar? The Pride Lands, once vibrant and full of life under Mufasa's wisdom, become a dark and barren wasteland, a melancholy mirror of its tyrant's empty and corrosive soul. The destruction was not merely physical. The dried-up pastures, the water scarcity, the absence of animal and plant life, the breaking of the ecological balance. It was also ecological, social, and moral. Scar, by focusing solely on his own power, his ephemeral glory, and his distorted vision of progress and order, which meant exploiting resources without considering long-term consequences or sustainability, ignored the delicate balances of nature and the vital interconnectedness of the circle of life. His ego-driven governance, based on domination and fear, led the kingdom to scarcity, disease, and widespread desolation. His leadership was marked by insatiable greed, oppressive tyranny, and rampant exploitation, a bitter reflection of his own empty soul and his failure to understand the true meaning of power, service, and responsibility. This character shapes the world around him not through construction or development, but through corrosion and disintegration. The consequences of his rule are widespread famine that plagues the kingdom, relentless discord among the species that once lived in harmony, and the paralyzing fear that permeates every shadow, every corner of the territory. Scar's lack of empathy, his inability to connect with the needs and suffering of his people, and the absolute centralization of power in his hands result in a tyrannical regime that exhausts not only natural resources, but also the hope, morale, and resilience of his subjects, driving them to despair. He becomes the mirror of his own internal destruction, a nefarious projection onto the outside world, creating a kingdom in his own image, desolate, lifeless, and collapsing. His legacy is one of scarcity and suffering. The philosophical reflection here is profound and disquieting. Who are we to judge those who, consumed by the pain of invisibility, by the frustration of not being recognized, or by a feeling of injustice, seek validation in such destructive ways? Scar is a mirror for the shadow that resides within all of us, the part that yearns for recognition, for power, for control, and that may feel tempted to cross moral boundaries when frustration becomes unbearable, and the perception of injustice deepens to the point of distorting all reality. He reminds us that repressed hatred and the desperate search for validation can corrupt even the deepest family ties, transforming a family member into the most desolating and dangerous adversary, capable of destroying not just a life, but a legacy, an entire kingdom, and the very essence of existence. Scar's story is not just about an iconic villain. It is about the danger of allowing envy and resentment to grow unchecked, and about the importance of dealing with one's own insecurities and frustrations constructively and healthily before they consume everything. The Pridelands, over time, recovered under new leadership that restored the circle of life. But Scar's scar remains in collective memory, a perpetual reminder that darkness does not always come from outside, but can insidiously flourish in the depths of the human soul, and that the actions of a single distorted mind, driven by resentment and boundless ambition, can have devastating repercussions on an entire ecosystem, both natural and social. But perhaps he was not the last. The cycle of ambition, jealousy, and the pursuit of power always lurks in the shadows of existence, awaiting a new opportunity to resurface in other hearts and minds, challenging the resilience of life and the hope for harmony. Scar's story is a somber and timeless echo of the complexities of the human psyche. It forces us to confront the corrosive fragility of envy, the overwhelming toxicity of resentment, and the devastating power of a mind that, feeling diminished and ignored, chooses the path of destruction. Scar was not just a lion. He was the personification of bitterness, a solemn warning about the paths that the desperate pursuit of validation can take when the thirst for power overrides all moral considerations. In the end, his own ruin was the inevitable result of his inability to see beyond himself, his egoistic blindness, and his insatiable thirst for a power he never truly knew how to wield for good. The Pridelands recovered, life flourished once more, but Scar's scar, the legacy of his tyranny, remains as a perpetual reminder that darkness does not always come from outside, but can flourish insidiously in the depths of the soul itself, inviting us to reflect on our own shadows and the choices we make.